Welcome back, everybody, to linuxacademy.com. My name is Terry, and in today's course, we continue our preparation for the Linux Foundation Certified System Administration exam. We are in our HTTP services section. We continue to talk about setting up name-based virtual web hosts. As we've talked about in our previous videos, we've separated out name-based virtual host setup in Apache between the Debian and Ubuntu based distributions and the Red Hat and CentOS based distributions, as the setup and configuration and use of them are different across those distribution types. And then we've also broken it out by HTTP versus HTTPS, since again those distribution types handle it a little bit differently, and we will use that to enable a little additional granular control in our name-based virtual host setup. So for CentOS and Red Hat based distributions, which is what we're talking about here, the first thing obviously is you need to make sure that you have Apache 2 installed, which in this case for CentOS based systems would be a yum install on HTTPD, and that will install the Apache system as well as any of the dependencies. Now it will not start the HTTPD server. So if I were to, for example, open up my web browser and go to the IP address for this server, which in our case on this one is 52.257.54, we see unable to connect, but we can fix that using the appropriate, and this happens to be a CentOS 7 box, which is a systemd system. So if we do a systemctl, let's enable it to be sure that HTTPD will start on boot. And then we'll do a systemctl start on HTTPD to make sure that it is now available. We can check using a PSAUX, grepping on HTTP, and it should tell us a number of processes that are starting. Now if I get the try again, now I get the default or catch-all vhost that's set up when you install your web server from Apache. Now there's a couple things that we want to do in Apache. So unlike Debian or Ubuntu based systems, it's not etc Apache D or Apache 2, it's HTTPD is my main configuration. Now my configuration file that I care the most about is in conf, and we'll see an httpd.conf file. So if I go vim on httpd.conf, then this is my configuration where we've looked at in the past. We've looked at what were, the ports that we're listening on, the module configuration, et cetera, et cetera. But what we care about right now is we're going to go all the way down here to the bottom, and we're going to add an include directory for a specific directory to hold our vhosts. Now, by default, in Apache on Ubuntu or on CentOS and Red Hat based distributions, you would define your vhost from within the HTTP configuration file itself. I don't like that configuration, and generally most people will change it from an administration standpoint because it gives you easier visibility if you don't have all your configurations in one file. Not to mention the fact that every time you change an HTTP configuration file, you can delay the amount of time it takes you to bring your system back up, because if you've got a configuration issue in the virtual host, you want to separate that from the system configuration. So what we do is we do an include optional, and then we do a vhost.d, which used to be the standard for vhost configurations in Red Hat and CentOS based distributions. Include optional rather. And this will allow us to create our vhost from within that directory. If you wanted to make it exactly the same as Ubuntu Debian, you could add include optional on sites enabled in star.conf, and then you could just link creating directory sites available and enabled, and then you could do manual links between them. We're going to differentiate that because you don't often see that configuration on CentOS and Red Hat based. You do see the vhost.d configuration, but you can do it however you're comfortable with as an administrator and engineer. Now what we do need to do though is we do need to add the directory makehost or vhost.d by doing a make directory vhost.d, or when we go to restart our system, if that directory doesn't exist, the HTTP server won't actually start. So in that vhost.d directory, now that we've got that out of the way, we can go in and create our vhost configuration. Now again, the default location for websites is var www and then HTML. And if we go into the HTML directory, we see that there's nothing currently there, but we could add a file there, whatever we wanted to do. In our case, what we want to do is we want to do a make directory on tcox. In this case, I think it's tcox4 is what we've been assigned so far. So tcox4 is going to be our tcox4.mylabserver.com, which is my Linux Academy lab server running CentOS 7. And if I do a vim on index.html, then I can create my HTML file like we did before, where we do a custom configuration that lets us know that we have reached a different directory than the default. So we'll do an h2 and then tcox4.mylabserver.com h2, and then we'll close all the tags. Now we've got a default configuration file that should bring up the index.html. We'll go back to our etc httpd and then vhost directory, and we'll create an http vhost for tcox4.linuxacademy.com like we've done before. So we're going to do a vim. We don't have a default configuration that's external to the HTTP configuration to copy from like we did in the Ubuntu Debian demonstration. So that we're going to create it with the major sections that we need by default. So we're going to say tcox4.mylabserver.com. We'll indicate that it's HTTP, and don't forget to put .conf since that's what we indicated in the HTTP configuration file. You don't have to put .conf on it if you just do a star include for the include optional, but again, the configuration file makes it clear that it's actually a configuration file. So we need to start with a virtual host definition. So again, this was done for us previously to this video in the Ubuntu Debian, but we just are defining a virtual host. And within that virtual host, we're going to define a server name. In our case, tcox4.mylabserver.com. A server alias, we're just going to say tcox4 for local browsing. We have to define a document root, basically where our website exists, var www, in this case tcox4. We need to create an error log. Normally this would have been done for us, but in our case, because we're starting from scratch, we're just going to put var www tcox4, and then we call error log, and then a custom log in var www tcox4, and we can just call it custom log combined. We're referring to the log type, and again, if you're looking for what that particular reference means, we go over that when we talk about Apache log file configuration within this course. So I recommend, if you haven't already seen that video, if you want to know what that combined reference is, what we're talking about here. So, okay, so we've got a server name, a server alias, where our documents are, where our error logs are, where our custom logs are, and then all we have to do at this point is close the virtual host tag, and then we will be done with this virtual host configuration. So we go ahead and save that file. Now all we should have to do would be to run the systemctl stop httpd and then start httpd. If we've made any mistakes either in the configuration file or in the vhost file, that should tell us when we restart the server. So we do a systemctl status on httpd service, and it should tell us what our issue is. No such file or directory for the configuration check that we just ran. So there's a directory missing, so we know that the vhost D directory exists, so we might have forgotten to end one of the directories correctly here, which we did. So the error log is looking for var www tcox, which doesn't exist, so let's make sure that we fix that path. So that's one of the good things from an Apache perspective for a systemd system is the system control status, if you have an error, can kind of direct you into what the issue was. So let's just audit here. We've got tcox4 in all of the locations, my document root, my error log, and my custom log. That should be good. Now I should be able to do a systemctl start on HTTPD. We'll verify that it's running on HTTP. It looks like it is. So tcox4.mylabserver.com should be what we should be able to see our configuration file that we put together for this specific named vhost. So tcox4.mylabserver.com then tells us tcox4.mylabserver.com now is picking up for the vhost that we created in our external vhost.d directory named for that specific server name and that location on our system. So once we have Apache installed, we externalized our vhost configuration in a directory called vhost.d. You could do it the same way that Ubuntu and Debian does, but in our case, we used vhost.d to differentiate the two. We created a very simple virtual host that defined the virtual host to listen on port 80, and we indicated to answer for the server name and the server alias tcox4.mylabserver.com, and then pointed to the document root that we created earlier so that it would serve up this particular file. So for CentOS and other RPM-based distributions, using Apache, that's all there is to setting up a named virtual host. My name is Terry for Linux Academy.